When we left Part 1, Rome faced a paradox. Expansion was no longer a strategy. It was a survival mechanism. The state, the army, and the elites were all caught in a system that couldn't function without war. Peace had become dangerous, and Rome was about to find out why. This is Part 2 of the empire that couldn't afford peace, here on Wealth Casebook. We're not talking about heroic battles or legendary generals. We're talking about financial mechanisms that trapped an entire civilization. Rome had built a delicate ecosystem: permanent armies, elite investors expecting returns, contractors and tax farmers profiting from expansion. But what happens when the well runs dry? The flow of new provinces slowed. Conquests became harder. The Mediterranean was no longer a frontier of easy plunder, and suddenly Rome faced a terrifying problem. It owed more than it could generate. The state had two options: reduce obligations. Impossible. Soldiers and elites would rebel. Extract more from what already existed: the provinces, and ultimately its own citizens. Rome chose the second. Rome's solution was brutal but systematic. 1. Heavier taxation. Provinces and citizens were squeezed. The publicani, private tax collectors, often skimmed profits on top of state levies. Ordinary people bore the weight. Elites found ways to shield themselves. 2. Debt consolidation and financial repression. Debts to the state became harder to repay. Interest rates on private loans rose. Currency devaluation made obligations easier for the state, but crushed the lower classes. 3. Land concentration. Soldiers granted land in conquered territories created dependency on expansion. Wealthy elites bought more land, consolidating economic power. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome was trapped in a feedback loop. More extraction, more unrest, less revenue flexibility, more financial stress. Debts and obligations grew faster than the economy could sustain. The famous denarius devaluation wasn't the start of Rome's crisis. It was a symptom. Why? Soldiers had to be paid. Contractors and financiers had to be rewarded. Tax farmers needed their profits. The state simply didn't have enough silver to honor these promises. Solution: debase the currency. Reduce silver content while keeping nominal face value. Result: prices rose, inflation, confidence eroded. Ordinary citizens' wealth disappeared. Elites protected themselves through land, foreign holdings, and preferential access. Rome didn't fall from coins alone. It fell from a structural addiction to expansion and debt, of which debasement was just a visible sign. The ripple effects were devastating. Soldiers' loyalty shifted further toward generals. Generals could promise pay and land; the state alone could not. This fueled civil wars, political capture by elites. Senators and equities increasingly financed campaigns. Policy and law favored financial profit over public stability. Public trust evaporated. Institutions were hollowed out. Civic engagement collapsed. The government could not enact reforms without resistance. Rome had created a system with no off switch. Here's the key lesson: when expansion stops, obligations remain. Rome's solution: extract from its own citizens. Heavier taxation, inflation through currency debasement, forced labor and military conscription, confiscation of wealth. Expansion failure became a social crisis. The state was no longer a protector. It became a predator. Rome didn't collapse because enemies breached the gates. It collapsed when the internal math stopped working, and no one could turn off the machine. This isn't just history. Systems built on expansion, whether military, economic, or financial, share the same pattern: short-term profits, long-term obligations, elite incentives, system capture, structural dependency, fragile equilibrium. Rome shows us what happens when peace becomes unaffordable, debt is normalized, money is no longer backed by productive capacity. Even today, empires and large states wrestle with these invisible forces. From Rome, we can learn. Systems trap their participants. Individuals or states may seem free, but structural incentives dominate. Debt is more than money. It shapes behavior, creates dependencies, and forces actions. Financial and social resilience matter more than conquest. Rome had manpower, gold, and skill, but no buffer against its own system. Watch incentives, not appearances. Expansion may feel optional until it isn't. Rome's collapse wasn't sudden. It was predictable, not because Romans were weak, corrupt, or unlucky, but because their system was designed to demand constant expansion. When growth slowed, the machinery turned inward. The very people the empire was meant to protect were now carrying the cost. History doesn't repeat exactly, but patterns endure. Your key takeaway: always trace the incentives and follow the money. Only by seeing the structure behind the headlines can you protect yourself, financially and strategically. If you found this eye-opening, subscribe to Wealth Casebook for deep dives into historical financial systems, lessons on money, power, and systemic risk. Stories most people aren't taught. And don't forget, Part 1 is where the trap begins. Part 2 shows why the empire couldn't survive peace. Hit subscribe and follow the series to understand the mechanics behind collapse.